I think we'll get going, and I'm sure that there'll be a few more people who will be joining us. But good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this EPA Alumni Association Academy presentation. I'm Walter Mugden. I'm an association board member, and I'm co-chair of the Academy program. The EPA Alumni Association has over 3,200 members with more than 81. I'm going to ask everyone to keep yourself on mute. We have over 3,200 members with more than 81,000 years of public service. That's pretty impressive. If you're not already a member of the association, I certainly encourage you to join. The price is right. It is free. Now, today's program is about building the green grid. A modernized green or smart grid is really essential to efficiently distribute electricity from diverse sources, including, of course, power generated from renewable sources such as solar and wind. Recently, demand for electric power has spiked, and demand is projected to further increase dramatically in the next few years. The increases are attributable largely to the construction of massive data centers to support AI development and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. America's outdated power grid leaves much renewable energy capacity unable to be fully utilized. Development of a green or smart grid is essential for a sustainable and integrated energy system. Our two expert speakers today will describe the surge in electricity demand, explain why our current grid is not up to the task, and discuss what's needed to make the necessary improvements. Mike Jacobs is Senior Energy Analyst with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. His work brings new technologies to wider adoption in the electric utility sector. He released an analysis of data center connection projects in a large regional transmission area. He filed the interconnection application for the first offshore wind farm in the US, and he completed the first interconnection agreement for a wind farm in New England. He was also part of a team that designed and built the first commercial wind plus storage project in Hawaii. He specializes in renewables integration, storage, including fast responding batteries, interconnection for wind and solar, and creative transmission solutions. Girish Behal is Vice President for Projects and Business Development at the New York Power Authority. He works on building strategic partnerships with the authority's local and global industry stakeholders to meet New York State's ambitious goals on electrification and decarbonization. He focuses on transmission development, renewable integration, storage development, and other grid-scale technologies. He previously worked with SNC-Lavalin, where he built and worked with multidisciplinary teams to support offshore wind development and provided due diligence and technical advisory services to renewable industry clients. So if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations by Mike and Girish. And by the way, at the end of the presentation, if you're interested and willing, you're welcome to stay on the line for a little longer and chat among your colleagues who are also there. We're going to let Mike and Girish get back to their jobs at that point, but for those who'd like to stay on, have a little further conversation, that'll be great. So let me now invite Mike to share his PowerPoint presentation and kick off the program.
Thank you, Walter. Let me touch a couple of buttons here. Share and animate. All right. Thank you, folks. Thank you all for joining me in doing this.
Mike, your PowerPoint has not yet shared. If you think it has, it hasn't.
What are we doing wrong? Did that make it work?
Not yet.
So let me go backwards here.
You have authority to share. I have your PowerPoint, so if you want me to share it, I'm happy to. Oh, it's coming up now. Okay, good.
All right. My apologies.
Now what we're seeing is yours. There we go. Now if you full screen that, we should be great. There it is. Excellent.
All right. All right. So to continue, so glad to meet all of you. Thank you for taking the time in your day to join me in this. Hoping we can share some understanding about the changing dynamics in the power sector, affecting costs, air emissions, regulatory gaps, and some areas for solution. I am Mike Jacobs, Union Concerned Scientist, Clean Energy Program. I advocate in state, federal, and utility regional policy arenas. and I try to keep up with the changes in the power sector. So let me offer just this picture here, this background that somebody in our communications people found. This is a solar plus storage project under construction. All these white boxes are batteries, and all the blue and black you see off in the distance are solar panels. So things have changed, and they continue. Um, so here we go. So data centers have become a significant topic and focus in energy policy broadly defined. Last November, I attended the National Association of Utility Regulatory Commissioners Conference, NARUC, they call it. It was in Seattle. Microsoft, Amazon, local favorites, Google were featured with speaking roles at the, association's meeting. This particular little tabletop was the booth provided by Google at the conference. Um, in addition, North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NERC, the U.S. Department of Energy, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, all have significant ongoing efforts regarding data centers, as do many states. And like at NARUC, these folks are wrestling or embracing or both the load growth issues that have come along. And this debate in these arenas is pretty largely dominating what's going on to the detriment of all the other things you used to be familiar with in the energy policy arena. So my work is largely about transmission, the connective infrastructure needed for all the rest of the electric power system. I've been working for over 2 decades in the Mid-Atlantic primarily. That grid operator for that region is called PJM. Originally, it was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, PJM. That now includes Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all of Virginia, and DC and the Delmarva Peninsula. And so this is a picture I took on my way home. I go out of my way, for grid infrastructure. Also, as you heard, I've had some involvement with the offshore wind industry, and I got to give you a little, good news where we find it. The additions of renewable energy really are significant these days. In recent years, this has really been the focus, still going on. This is the Vineyard Wind project at an earlier stage. That project is now completed construction last week, announcement Friday. So there's 3 offshore wind farms providing power to the electricity grid in the U.S., all in the Northeast, just south of New England. 3 new offshore projects in the U.S., joining 2 small ones that were already operating, all in the same region. We also have under construction off of Virginia a very substantial project, offshore wind. So the story about these really has to be understood as their significance for the grid and for meeting climate goals in these regions. These 3 offshore wind projects are the largest renewable energy power plants in the East, excluding the, Niagara Falls, the hydros, pump storage that are over 50 years old. So let me describe these a little bit. In this picture, you see these turbines, they're a mile apart from each other. There's 62 machines, turbines, for this offshore wind project called Vineyard Wind. Not far away from it is the Revolution Wind project, which just started to export power. That will have 65 turbines. Those wind farms are 800 megawatts and 704 megawatts, respectively. The Coastal Virginia project, 176 turbines, 2,600 megawatts. Yeah, so that's currently under construction for Virginia. All these things were delayed, as you can imagine. I've been involved. It's point of pride, but also there is no more construction plan now under the Trump administration, and the supply chains have been messed with because of these delays. All right, now really to the topic of data centers. So data center growth. Here's a picture of a baseball park in Lowell, Massachusetts, and the former Prince Spaghetti Factory in Lowell that has been converted to be a data center. This data center growth is driven by artificial intelligence, AI, expectations, and the investment going on with that. It's currently unevenly distributed around the US, and it's a little hard to know how this is going. There's an inordinate amount of non-disclosure agreements protecting everything about these projects, and people are trying to glean from the sort of associated permitting that's required. And in my work, I pulled that information from the local utilities transmission level information. So the projects that I've kept track of require transmission level infrastructure to connect. So to say that again, the distribution wires you have in your street aren't good enough for this kind of volume of consumption. They need their own transmission lines to their property. So Virginia, Northern Virginia in particular, has been the greatest concentration of data centers on the planet so far. And the projects themselves number, as you can see, just in the last 2 years, 85 more such large enough that they need transmission level connections. That seems to be plateauing due to both the infrastructure limits and available land in the area. What we saw electrically, these were are the size of cities. The favorite in Virginia is 300 megawatts per application, per building. And that's, the city of Lansing, Michigan's utility is about 300 megawatts. And this kind of activity has caused supply chains to hit their maximum. And the sort of basic supply to build new power plants can't keep up at the pace that the data centers are building. And we're seeing that in this PJM region distinctly. There's a link here for a blog, one of a series I've been writing about this, that sort of tabulates this 85 and the growth in 8 states in the PJM region, basically surrounding Washington, D.C. So the costs of these equipment is going up. The cost of the power supply is going up. PJM operates an auction process, so the price of power plant capacity is very quickly translated, observed, and passed on to customers. So there's not just our reports, there's other reports about the cost impacts showing up in these regions with high growth rates. So in my work, I did a study and found 8 states were seeing this kind of transmission level work, and it cost, in those 2 years I mentioned, $7 billion in more costs to go into rates to be paid for by all customers. Let me actually go back and talk about this a little bit further. So I said the 8 states: Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia. And the size of the data center seems to grow as the sort of progress, what we're seeing. So Virginia, where it started, the average has been under 200 megawatts. In Pennsylvania, the average data center getting this kind of transmission service is 500 megawatts. And the new proposals in Illinois average 800 megawatts for a customer. Yeah. So this has impacts, like I said, on the supply chain, and then it sort of creates these other odd turns, which I'll explore further. The data centers that want to provide their own generation are using truck-mounted turbines by the dozens, and this is the kind of generation that it's truck-mounted, it's relatively lightweight, it's not really meant for round-the-clock use. I've said this is what you might bring in for an emergency after disaster, maybe. I could characterize it worse than that, but I'll be careful. There's simple cycle for, folks in the air world. This is a simple cycle turbine. What we use for power generation is usually combined cycle. So the combined cycle is more efficient. The simple cycle really needs 50% more fuel to do the same power production. 50% more fuel means 50% more emissions. Um, yeah. The regulatory gaps that this is exposing also get to, individual customers that can cause costs for other customers. The regulatory world usually has a good system for sorting that out, and we don't tend to have individual customers that can tip the scales individually so much. And then there's reliability impacts that have made the utility world's, hair curl, to say the least. Because again, single customer that large, whatever they do can show up. So we'll get some more about this. I'll elaborate. Um, so again, most of my work was in the, sort of mid-Atlantic and Virginia. Then a reporter contacted me and asked to look at this project in New Mexico, where they're going to build for themselves. Walter was mentioning the New York Times recently ran an article, I guess, about the sort of go it alone, build a microgrid for your own supply. There's there's pros and cons to this. So this project in New Mexico, their microgrid will have as much electric generation as the state of Vermont or Rhode Island host for one customer. So they're off the grid electrically. Obviously, they're connected to the water, they're connected to the gas pipeline system. And of course, the airshed, doesn't know anything about a grid. So they're proposing 40 combustion turbines at two sites. Apparently, the sort of structure of this allows them to deal with the air permits. I've been reading those air permits and not fully understanding what I'm looking at. And the reporter was also asking me some questions. So maybe afterward, I might get a little help on that. But what they're talking about really is 1,200 megawatts on the east side and then 987 megawatts on the west side with their own transmission lines and no interaction, no connection with the electric grid otherwise. So this also evades kind of the existing regime of utility regulation and the obligations that go along with being a utility. So kind of new territory and, a bit of a regulatory gap to be sorted out as to how the existing rules that apply to utilities apply to such a thing and what you want, what you don't want. That's unusual. So it is so far been very unusual. Honestly, the way this used to work was pot growers in North Carolina. I'm sorry, in Northern California would do this kind of thing. Um, so anyway, the the norm for data centers is they take power from the grid. They don't want to be in the power plant business. They just soon outsource that like all the rest of us generally do. So the connection to the grid then brings these other interactions, the cost to all ratepayers, for example. So the study I did specifically about transmission, the transmission rates are done at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Consumer rates are set at the state. This is a gap that just the existing usual practices allow the costs for connecting the data center to be put into the transmission rate, which is then spread across all the customers in that region or in that state. So that's an issue. And then PJM also has clearly demonstrated this problem where the energy supply is taxed, is, bid up in its cost by the new load, by the new data centers, and that new cost, it applies to everybody in the region. So it's 13 states plus the District of Columbia are seeing unprecedented prices for their annual capacity needs because the auction is run to clear for the new demand. And essentially, the sort of new demand pushes the price up that everybody pays. That's sort of the exotic way it works in the specific place. But even if you have a vertically integrated utility and they're just buying new generators to meet their new customer, the supply chain picture has caused the costs to be higher. So it's only a marginal increase to the total cost, but even that has been elevated by this new energy supply picture. The reliability story has really had some attention from NERC, from the folks who do these reliability standards. But there's two ways this works. One is the demand grows faster than the supply can grow. So you in PJM have the utility grid operator saying, we don't think it's as bad as it looks. Because they failed to meet their 1 day in 10 target in their most recent procurement. This is kind of unprecedented in people's current career, in the lifetime of people that's currently working. The second part of this reliability point, the data center operations pulse and stop and pulse in their normal operation for doing the tasks that they do. So this can be an 80% swing from their total consumption down to 20% of their consumption in a second, and then return after a second to go back up to their full consumption. So in fact, for a renewable energy guy who's heard the reliability debates about, solar being variable, this is way more variability than that. Than clouds passing, it's nothing like sunset. This is the kind of thing that's got NERC looking for ways to deal with this. And NERC, the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, does not currently have any interaction or influence or rules that pertain to customers. The rules always pertain to the utilities, the generators, the bulk power system. So there was never a customer that fell within their scope. But as you've heard, these customers are larger, than wholesale customers ever were. They're larger than cities. So again, I got a couple of references here on the bottom to support, from NERC at the bottom, and then the PJM Market Monitor just up from that. We'll share the slides as well. You'll be able to see these as well if you can't write them down, catch them now. So there's this behavior, and then, as I said, the sort of growth and the potential for costs, the reality of costs being spread are a matter for Department of Energy activity. FERC is certainly involved. Department of Energy asked FERC to get involved. State PUCs are involved in trying to sort this out at some level at the initiative of the utilities who see this might not be the best public relations, or more importantly, they might make expenditures that they can't recover. So at the state PUCs, the primary activity you see the utilities take is ensuring they get paid by these new customers. Microsoft, probably not the same credit risk, but that's what the utilities are spending their time on, is make sure we get paid if we're going to have these customers on our system. So there's some irony there. So this is a data center in your neighborhood. This again is that Spaghettiville plant in Lowell, Massachusetts, right at the end of the street. That's the way this is going. So we've been working on some solutions as a advocacy world broadly, at UCS in particular. There's enormous interest across the government for solutions, for ways to address these issues. We get calls from state and federal legislators. I said the Department of Energy. The White House got involved. The White House invited a coalition of state governors that have already been involved in the PJM region. Yeah, it's not normal. And my work never got this kind of attention before. So the sort of favorite and the easiest thing to get people attention to is Beyonce. not coincidentally the same name as a fabulous star. Bring your own new clean energy. This is basically a sort of mandate, hopefully to impose on the data center folks who have as much money as any corporations ever to solve this problem that they're causing. Bring your own, but bring it clean. Doesn't have to be an islanded system like that New Mexico scenario, but if you're having trouble keeping up with demand, maybe you can bring some supply. That's an idea. And the alternative, how about we just have costs assigned to those who cause them? Very typical utility regulatory mandate, objective practice. But like I said, that regulatory gap between federal and state has made that a clouded matter. States have some authority. They haven't always been clear on using it. We're plugging away at that to try to solve some of these holes. The reliability issue has got to be dealt with at this FERC process. And then, water, noise, those are local issues for local regulators. So that's sort of the broad scope. The citation there is for comments I was part of in Illinois. And then UCS recently put out a sort of broad, elaborate study about modeling the electric supply for the growth from data centers, also electrification, transportation, and home heating. This focused on the policy benefits and how to meet this growth, cleanly. Got a lot of press. Somebody assembled all these press clippings. Again, lots of interest, lots of attention across the states that are seeing this kind of growth. And with that, I have an invitation to join our science network at UCS. We have a sort of formal means to invite citizens into our advocacy work. It's particularly well suited for folks who, can follow a regulatory narrative because it's, you might remember, not always easy for the general public to understand what we're all talking about. So please give that a look and we can stay in touch. And I thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was interesting, fascinating, scary, worrisome, all of the above. But I'm now going to invite Girish to bring up his PowerPoint presentation and take over. And again, just as a reminder, Girish is with the New York Power Authority, and they're on the other end of this problem, having to try and figure out how to deal with it. So over to you, Girish.
Thank you, Walter. Thanks a lot, Mike. I think you've set the stage pretty well with respect to the conversation around what's going on in PJM. So my lift is going to be a lot easier because all I have to do is talk about a single state ISO, right? It makes it a lot easier. The way I've structured the presentation is, we'll go through a little bit of a background on the Power Authority, and then, I'm going to kind of try and explain to the folks here in terms of what is the picture, or what has been a picture and what currently is about electricity generation in New York, its consumption, and, where we see challenges and what we are doing on the grid to improve the grid. So from our standpoint, I mean, the Power Authority was formed under the Federal Power Act goes back all the way till 1930s. And, we own one of the largest vintage hydro plants that Mike pointed about as Niagara Falls one. And we also, it's called Robert Moses, and we also own another on St. Lawrence River with combined generation, slightly more than 2.5 gigawatts. And when we start adding, pump storage, it gets very quickly up to 4 gigawatts of overall capacity. We are a public authority. We are not taxpayer funded. So we are a self-funded authority, which means that, we are like any other private organization from that standpoint, that we have to manage our assets in a manner that generate enough revenue for us to operate and maintain our AA rated bond rating. We own 1,550 miles of high voltage transmission. It's 230, 345, 700 yeah, we do have a 765, and we have a whole bunch of other assets. One of the key assets that we have is, and it is part of our enabling legislation, is the ability to serve what we call governmental customers, cities, towns, agencies, entities, and help them manage and reduce their and basically manage their energy use and help them be more energy efficient. Uh, for folks who don't know, the first generation plant in the US was installed not in Niagara, not in Buffalo, but in New York City back in 1882. But the actual distribution of large scale energy happened in Buffalo with the build out of what used to be the old Edison plant there in the falls. Now, I mean, we have had a very, very significant, diverse resource base, but there has been a very, very significant change in the generation and consumption market in New York, and it has been, due to a very, very broad set of circumstances. A number of that has to do with regulations, with FERC policies. It's both local and a global demand. New York has spent probably same amount, if not more, than California on energy efficiency because that is the biggest bang for the buck in terms of how efficiently we can use that energy. And I like to at least point out to folks that you know energy is very important for today's economies, considering that New York accounts for roughly, I believe, um, roughly 6% of U.S. population. The exact number is around 5.8. That's a pretty large number. Uh, in terms of economy and GDP numbers, we are the third largest in the U.S. and it's the eighth largest economy in the world. If you like to keep track of some of those numbers, uh, but even after that, New York today utilizes the least amount of electricity per capita. So just from a context standpoint. Now, when we start looking at larger numbers, um, I pulled a number of these pieces of information from EIA database and from NYSERDA database and look at, a span that makes sense, 40, 45 period spans starting in 1979. The data set itself goes back to 1960. But you can see, that consistently the demand has grown in New York for electricity. It's been up by 35%. But the real breakout, if you pay attention to, is right at the bottom. The burnt orange one is the industrial one. New York at one time used to be a powerhouse of manufacturing. Um, and by 2009, that demand had a significant destruction. We were less than half in terms of electricity demand for manufacturing. But on the flip side, the commercial and the residential, needs have gone up significantly. Uh, right now, our 2023 numbers, that the last we have, are slightly higher than 2009. But again, what we are seeing now is an increased demand in terms of energy for industrial manufacturing, right? It's so right now we have Micron fab that's going to come in. We'll talk more about it. We've got a fab that's coming in from Global Foundries. Those are the two big ones. We also have some smaller additional manufacturing coming back to the state of New York. Again, they're attracted by well-educated workforce and access to both energy, both renewable and emissions-free energy and gas gen, plus an atmosphere which has become more welcoming to businesses. But again, the key here is that the commercial consumption has gone up, which is primarily, industrial, not industrial, but warehousing demands. It's a lot of has to do with what we'd call services businesses, and subsequently, just the tremendous growth we've seen over the last 20 years of the residential demand, which now is starting to stabilize. One thing I do want to point out that even though, the residential demand has sort of stabilized in terms of the utilization, the number of housing units actually has gone up. And one of the largest contribution, and this goes back to the conversation, is like, how are we reducing emissions and how are we greening the grid or greening the grid further? Is the wholesale move, or I would say rotation of the housing stock. There's was a lot of housing that was built back in the 60s and the 70s that is now being replaced with bigger buildings with more housing, but those same units are much more significantly energy efficient, leading to same utilization of the energy, with increased number of households. So the efficiencies have gone up dramatically, and we are finally starting to see the result of that in the housing stock. This is also some of the other things here. Wanted to kind of just share another view of this. Is there was a lot of energy efficiency work done back in the 80s and the 90s after the oil shock. Subsequent to that, New York had a loss of manufacturing. But again, starting back in the 90s into early 2000s, we start to see again an increased both commercial and residential utilization of energy. This is from another data set. Again, it is a nicer data set from USEIA. The energy mix in New York has changed quite significantly from 1960 to 2023. And that's the last year that we have the data set for right now. Even though electricity generation has gone up, coal is zero. The last coal plant I believe we shut down was back in 2014, slightly earlier than that. But there's, obviously new energy resources have come in. Natural gas right now primarily is contributing to electricity generation. And you can see the change in terms of also the imports that we have both from Quebec, Ontario, PJM, and ISO New England. Most of the energy that comes in from Quebec is hydro, so is relatively clean. The energy that we bring in from Ontario is a mix of hydro and nuclear and some fossil there, so there are some brown electrons. PJM is also a mix between nuke and gas, and New England, for the most part, is again nuclear and gas. Now, we've talked about a lot about the generation, but one of the other things that has happened over the last, I would say, 15 years in New York is we have been steadily investing in building out our transmission infrastructure. Uh, by we, I mean the state of New York has invested with the utilities, with what we are doing in the Power Authority, roughly 25 billion. So we would have invested $25 billion by the end of 2030 in grid in the grid, whether it's the transmission system level or the distribution system level. What I've highlighted here on this slide are some of our larger transmission projects that have happened in the state of New York. There's Champlain Hudson is one of the last projects there that currently will be in service in about another 2 months. And that should bring roughly 1.2 gigawatts of hydro from Canada right into New York City. The challenge that we've had, and one of the reasons why you see this being built out is a separation, or what we like to call the tale of two grids. Somewhere just south of Eshokan project, there's a line that divides the state of New York, where majority of the generation in the state is above that line, and the majority of the consumption of electricity is below that line. It technically, we call it a Central East Total East interface, but realistically, that's the Lower Hudson Valley, right? Majority of the load is going to be Lower Hudson Valley. It's going to be Westchester. It's going to be New York City, and Long Island. So for us, a number of these projects, when we look at the Con Ed Trace project, we look at Propel, we look at Central East Energy Connect, we look at Smart Path, is to enable getting a lot of the emissions-free resources, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, to the load center in south of there. In addition to these projects, there's roughly $4.5 billion that have been invested over the last 8 years in upgrading a number of 69 kV and 115 kV transmission lines in northern and central New York, primarily to bring on the renewable energy online. Um, when we've looked at it, the challenges have been, transmission lines. I'm not so sure why we call them transmission, but there are transmission lines at 115 kV voltage that were built back in the 40s with um, some of them have bundled 4-aught conductor. I mean, it's a and I'm not so sure if people understand the conductor size, but 4-aught conductor is literally just the copper wire, right? It's a very very small conductor. It really doesn't have any capacity. I mean, some of these projects are just reconductoring those to a higher conductor, and you can get 3 times more or 5 times more energy through the same line. Uh, Having said that, I mean, New York is challenged right now in terms of meeting its emissions-free energy goals. But what we are seeing in the market is a big interest from entities who want to come in and do business in New York is to build their own emissions-free generation. And they're looking at emissions free from a standpoint that New York has pushed its CLCPA goals, and they do want to be a partner to the state. And I think that's a big difference that we see here from perhaps places like Virginia, where they can get air permits to put up 25 megawatt airframe derivative air derivative turbines. That is challenged quite a bit in New York, both from the local public and from the regulatory entities. Uh, Now, the other piece there, what we are seeing in terms of the load growth coming up in New York, we just talked about some industrial load. Uh, the industrial load, like the Micron and the Global Foundries, Shivani and Pharma are some of the smaller ones. Uh, Between now and 2035 is expected to add anywhere from a 1.2 to 1.8 gigawatts of load. And for example, the Micron chip fab, they've already started construction. So our expectation is that load is going to come online on phases. It's going to get to roughly about a half a gigawatt by 2030 and then going to add more by 2035. The ultimate projections are that is going to be Micron itself is going to be roughly a 2 gigawatt load by 2040. In context, very similar to what Mike pointed out, that's about on a normal day, that's about 25% of what New York City uses with 10 million residents. That's on a normal day. On a peak day, it's a little bit less than I would say about uh 15% or 12 to 15%, depending upon what those numbers are. Uh, but most of the AI loads, they're in the interconnection queue. I mean, we have some small data centers, some 60 megawatts here, 30 megawatts there, but nothing on the scale that's being expected. And they're expected to add 8.4 gigawatts of load. Now, just compare that to the number that I gave you on a normal day. We're not talking peak loads, but normal loads. That's about the amount of electricity consumed in the New York City. Just in New York City, the five boroughs. That's it. It does not include Long Island. It does not include anything. So it is a massive number and a massive change for New York. One of the things I do want to point out, that is different in New York from PJM in terms of the rate structure. In New York, if you're a developer who is bringing in either new generation or the new load, the cost of transmission to connect that load or gen is the responsibility of the developer. So it does become an added interconnection cost for the developer from that standpoint. Very similar to what Mike pointed out in terms of what you're seeing in Virginia, we are seeing large loads, the data center loads, looking to bring their own energy with them. Again, they're targeting or trying to get emissions-free energy. One of the advantages that we do have, like I said, is we've got two areas, whether one is Quebec and another is Ontario, where we can connect to and gain energy. Uh, Something to be aware of, right? I mean, Quebec actually has a game plan to add roughly 10 gigawatts of new capacity, both hydro, wind, and solar over the next 10 years. Similarly, Ontario is moving forward with a plan to add roughly 8 to 10 gigawatts of new nuclear. So, there's a lot of energy or energy resources that are being added in the region, and we anticipate that New York will take advantage of some of those by importing them from either Ontario or Quebec. In addition to that, as you may be aware, Governor Hochul has indicated that New York will be looking to build out 5 gigawatts of nuclear in New York over the next few years. And by few, probably next 10 to 15 years. So that should hopefully help out with this. Um, Obviously, we had very high hopes of being able to tap into the offshore wind industry. That has been a little bit slow in terms of what is happening at the federal level. We do have a 132 megawatt project, relatively small, South Fork, coming on that has been online for a year. We expect Sunrise, which is about 880 megawatts, and probably an upgrade to that to a gigawatt coming online by, I believe, next year. We also expect Empire 1, which is going to be an 880 megawatt project, and they do have an additional increase on that to come online in about 2 years from now. So there are additional resources. I think what we are finding out is the net capacity factor on those is anywhere between 46% to 52%, which in a number of cases is just about the same as a number of combined cycle plants. And also, they're supporting us when there's a peak load during winter. We've talked about a lot of these things. I know Mike talked about the cost pressures in PJM, but the cost pressures in New York have been very different, right? The cost pressures in New York have been, again, related to assets that are 80 plus years old, right? The parts are just falling apart and you have to rebuild them. The resiliency upgrades that need to happen to storm harden a number of things in places like Long Island, Staten Island, Lower Westchester, and upstate from a snow and blizzard conditions. Um, Again, this is one of the things that we do have a significant impact on the transmission industry, network from a resiliency standpoint. because some of these storms that were 100-year storms or 300-year storms are now happening every 5, 7, 10-year time frame. Obviously, we have invested, or New York has invested a lot in energy efficiency, but the payback is quite great on those numbers. Um, like I said, so new loads, they're at least 2 to 4 years out. Uh, Based on some of the things that are happening, I'm not entirely sure if those loads will materialize in New York or to the extent that we expect them. But they sure, some of them will. And even if half of that materializes, that is expected to still put a significant strain on both the resources that we have in the state. Uh, so just, some things to think about. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Girish. And we do have in the chat quite a number of pieces of information that are not questions, but they're comments and observations about sources of information, similar issues elsewhere. There are a couple of questions, and I've got one or two that I'll pose. So this will be for either one of you. The one question in the chat is it refers to a New York Times article about data centers and how they're priced out. But if a data center that's being built goes bust, I'm not sure exactly why or how that might happen, but if it were to happen, are there sunk costs? Are these costs going to somehow reverberate elsewhere through to the customer base, the ratepayer base? I'm not sure I'm fully capturing the question, but maybe Mike, you can address that. Does that
Sure.
resonate with you?
Sure. So this has been front of mind for the utilities and their filings at the state public utility commissions, because the scenario is not simply scenario basically is that the data center boom turns into a bust and there's some kind of obsolescence cycle. The data center folks themselves will say they intend to replace the chips every 5 years. So, the utility, 5 years is the time it takes to order this stuff and get it installed, not place it second time. So,
Got it.
What's going on at the state level is letters of credit and deposits and obligations for the data center to make payments that the utility has calculated and absorbed to provide the capability to serve the data center. So this is really the focus of a lot of state level activity. Just that question.
Oh, I think Walter, to a certain extent, New York is sort of, or New York ratepayers are a little bit protected from that standpoint. The reason being, again, the rate structure, at least that the New York ISO has, is the developer is responsible for paying for the costs of the upgrades, right? So whether it's an energy developer or whether it's a load, they are responsible to pay for any of the system upgrades in terms of, whatever the cost is to connect to the transmission system. But
Right.
obviously, there's the ancillary cost of energy or marginal cost of energy going up because you're consuming capacity from the system. Um, so if they do go bust, then the energy prices tend to go down, I would say, because then it becomes a demand supply scenario.
Yeah. No, the big difference, I think, is the one you mentioned, which is that the developer is responsible here for the transmission lines. I think, Mike, you were saying that in PJM and maybe elsewhere in the country, that's not the case. And so I think that's an important difference. And an area where regulatory improvements might be appropriate. And we do have another question in the chat, but I'm going to stick my nose in here and say, hey, in the State of the Union, which I admit I did not watch, but I saw some reporting on it. I gather that President Trump announced that he was negotiating pledges from major tech companies to pay a greater share of these energy costs associated with these new data centers. But in the commentary on the news stories, there was experts saying, hey, any such promises are going to be very difficult to verify and certainly difficult to enforce. Is it realistic or meaningful to think that a voluntary agreement of that sort is going to be helpful, or do we really need regulatory obligations?
Combination of both, right? So like in New York, we do have a structure where some of the costs are directly allocated there. But I think, the other piece of the cost that we talked about in terms of the energy supply, uh, is going to be a little bit hard to determine what cost share is there or the cost increase is there because of a load or just because of the variability of supply and demand on the system, right? Um, so yes, I mean, it makes an interesting project for a PhD thesis and an agentic AI utilization to be able to create that. But there is a as a lawyer said to us last week, it's only math, but it's complicated math.
Well, it's also
Uh, yeah,
jurisdiction. I mean, the
Yeah.
lawyer missed his own opportunity because the federal government has no nexus with an electricity customer.
Yeah.
right.
So this is the regulatory gap, that's sort of my umbrella, and that's the challenge in all this, that the customers are so large, but the rules do not apply to them.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we do have some questions that are popping up at the chat now, and I'm going to ask one. What about battery storage? What's the state of the technology on that, and where are we headed in that area? This, of
Um,
course, refers specifically to solar and wind as being the
yeah.
things that
Uh,
need the battery storage most.
I mean, currently what we're seeing and what we are experiencing is still a big push or a big lean towards lithium-ion batteries, and that is starting to change with some other chemical configurations. So, I think for the time being, it's going to be a lithium-ion storage batteries that are being looked at and built out. And then, we'll have to, as the new technologies start coming mainstream, then, there's a possibility you'll have other chemistries that are not as challenging as lithium ion can get approved and built out.
Yeah, there is a fairly detailed and complicated follow-up question on this in the chat by my good friend and former colleague, John Hanson. Uh, talks about a study done by the Rocky Mountain Institute, which envisions a large amount, 60 gigawatts of peak demand reduction by 2030, scaling up to 200 gigawatts, again, a reduction by 2050, which is built on expanding base of distributed batteries, EVs, which can, I guess, themselves serve as a battery, smart thermostats, rooftop solar, and so forth. But all of those projections, as he points out, were developed in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act and the policies under that act, which have been largely abandoned. Uh, is there an opportunity for demand reduction as a result of some of these distributed battery storage and other kinds of technology?
So,
Or is
Girish,
that not
let me
happening?
offer, because this was an NGO. I might know some of those people, maybe. When they say demand reduction, they're talking about the peak demand. So a battery, is a time shift, right?
Yeah.
And the challenge to this, we see this in a couple of ways with solar, for example. You can get a marginal benefit the first time you do it, but that benefit declines when you have everybody doing the same thing. So a bunch of 4-hour batteries, which is what the lithium ion industry is kind of standardized on, can shift the peak 4 hours to another point in the calendar, another point in the day. So this stuff requires
Let
a
me
bunch
interject. Can they
of,
can they be staggered? So if the first group of 4-hour batteries discharges, then the next bundle of them, assuming there are more to be done, they can. So there can be some staggering. All right.
yes, but the way this all gets paid for and the
Yeah.
incentives, very blurry. And so it's a whole lot easier to describe it than it is to get paid for it.
Right. Understood. There was a question here for Girish, and I'm not even sure I understand the question, but I'll read it. How is New York Power Authority managing an increasingly important role in both demand side
So it
management
gets, yep.
and grid for enhancing technology? Yeah, so you understand it. So go ahead, Girish.
It's a very astute question. Let me say that a lot of people don't do the GETS or DSM. I think, just based on practical experience, gets some of the grid enhancing technologies are relatively easier to implement. We do have our own internal planning models and systems that we look at, and we are doing multiple studies with EPRI and a number of other entities in terms of where some of those gets can strategically be installed to manage grid congestion. On the DSM side, we tend to work with our customers in terms of what their load looks like and where that management needs to look like. It's more so from a VPP model where we tend to work with them to create sort of an a model or and subsequently management system which helps them uh, shift things. I would say whether shift demand from a certain time frame to a different time frame, enable different thinking in terms of how they are operating their assets to be able to basically enable more demand side management.
Thanks. We're at time. We're actually a little tiny bit over time, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator here to ask one more question. So, I have solar panels on my roof. Um, they generate on an annual basis a little bit more than I actually use in my home. Therefore, the way my utility, Con Edison, works it, I actually pay $0.00 for electric supply. Now, of course, I still pay a small amount for distribution. That's my share of the distribution network. But is it correct that I'm cheating the system? Because the way the distribution bill is calculated is on the total number of kilowatt hours that I use, and I'm using zero on an annualized basis. So I'm not paying, or am I? Am I paying or am I not paying my fair share for the transmission system? I don't know whether this is a little outside the system, outside the question of the green grid, but I'll pose it anyhow.
Yes and no, right? Because this is a classic free ridership issue, right? The question is, you are connected to the grid, right?
Yeah,
And you are consuming energy from the grid when
every
the
night.
solar panels are not generating, right?
Yeah,
And then you are basically putting energy back on the grid when they are generating excess of what you're using. I mean, I have solar panels too, so I understand that. It does become a question of, uh, you know, should you get paid the same amount for generating the energy and putting it back on the grid because solar is going to, help mitigate peaks, than the one that you're drawing, especially during winter when there's a less amount of solar. My view is, you're both the two hands wash each other because you're also supporting the grid, so you're sort of getting a benefit there from supporting the grid by not paying that delivery charge, right? So it's more like one hand washes the other, so to speak.
I'm
It,
happy if it stays
and
that way,
Mike,
but that's a personal
yeah,
thing.
and Walt, I can stay on for a few minutes. I know there are some other couple other questions. And
Right. There was a
yeah,
question in the chat that was very specific to the New York issue, and I don't know. It's in the chat there. If you have a chance to look at it, maybe you can respond to it. I don't want to have that question be taking everybody else's time. Uh, but first of all, let me just say thank you again to both of you for this. I'll risk the pun for this illuminating conversation. A couple of quick announcements for the attendees, and then we'll get back to any other questions that may be out there, or we can just chat. So please join us on Wednesday, the 8th of April, for our next Academy program, which is a success story of oceanic proportions. This is actually a good news story. It's about sustainable solutions that are revolutionizing the fishing industry. And the lead speaker will be Amanda Leland, who is the executive director of EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. And she has recently co-authored a book about this success approach to sustainable fisheries. And she'll be joined by a couple of longtime commercial fishermen who initially were deeply opposed to it and ultimately have become great enthusiasts for it. And on Tuesday, June 23rd, our program will be about a couple of successful and inspiring grassroots efforts to restore and rejuvenate a major riverine ecosystems, two major riverine ecosystems. So we got some good news in our programs coming up in April and June. In May, the Alumni Association has its annual meeting on May 7th in Washington, D.C., so we're not going to have a webinar program during May. But interestingly, Girish, you mentioned New York's goal of 5 gigawatts of new nuclear power, and we're actually planning in late fall an entire program on the potential for the nuclear industry to be rejuvenated. We know that recently the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I think just within the last couple of weeks, gave the first license for one of these so-called mini nuclear power plants in Wyoming to be built by Bill Gates, I think. So we're having a program that's going to come up later in the year about that. With that, let me again say thank you to both of you. Very, very interesting. And if you're able to stay on, that's great. If you have to go and do something more productive, you're obviously welcome to bow out at any time. But if any of the folks on the line want to open up their microphones and ask questions or make comments, we're able to do that a little bit here for a few more minutes.